Ja, guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich im Namen vom Fachbereich 12 Informatik und Herrn Professor Detlef Krömker heute Abend hier zu der Veranstaltung mit Richard Stallman. Bevor wir beginnen, noch ein paar Worte über all diejenigen, die uns geholfen haben. Wir sind so ein eingespieltes Team. Ich fange mal an mit denen, die neu im Boot sind. Unterstützt hat uns die Gewerkschaft für Erziehung und Wissenschaft. Ist da zufällig jemand im Raum? Ja, ganz ruhig aufstehen. Und dann haben wir die Firma Consilion. Ist da ein Vertreter da? Nee, scheint nicht so. Das sind unsere beiden neuen Unterstützer. Schon lange dabei ist das Frankfurt Free Software and Culture Institute, vertreten durch meine Wenigkeit, die Free Software Foundation mit Richard Stallman und die Gesellschaft für Informatik. Und da bitte ich jetzt noch den Herrn Steffen Schilke auf die Bühne, der ein paar Worte zur GI sagen will.
Hallo, ui, ist ja richtig voll hier. Die Gesellschaft für Informatik hat in ganz Deutschland Regionalgruppen, Hochschulgruppen und so weiter und so fort. Also ich mache es ganz kurz. Wir im Rhein-Main-Gebiet machen sehr viele interessante Veranstaltungen, die sich mit Themen der Informatik beschäftigen. Wir haben zum Beispiel nächsten Monat, Ende August, eine Veranstaltung zum Thema Open Data. Das kann man alles auf unserer Webseite sehen, kann man sich anmelden, die Veranstaltungen sind mehr kostenfrei. Wir freuen uns über jeden, der kommt und wir werden das ganze Jahr über noch sehr viele interessante Veranstaltungen anbieten. Also ich würde mich freuen, wenn Sie vorbeischauen würden. Und jetzt noch eine Frage, sind hier Studenten anwesend? Bitte mal die Hand heben. Sehr gut. Alles potenzielle Mitglieder der GI, weil als Student kann man in der GI kostenlos Mitglied werden. Einfach mal auf der GI-Webseite gucken und der Mitgliedschaft Häkchen setzen und Mitglied werden. Dann kann man an ganz vielen Fachgruppen, Hochschulgruppen, Regionalgruppen teilhaben und sehr viel über Informatik lernen. Vielen Dank.
Ja, vielen Dank, Steffen. Dann übergebe ich das Wort direkt an unseren Gast, Richard Stallman.
Before I start, I have some requests for you about photos and recordings. For photos, please do not put any photo which shows me into Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp. Those are three mouths of the same surveillance monster, which gobbles up data about people. It can recognize people by their faces or even the backs of their heads. So if you put a photo in which person P appears into that monster through any mouth, you are helping it track that person. You shouldn't do that to your friends, and please don't do that to me. Perhaps do that to your enemies. And best of all, don't have a Facebook account. Don't be a Zucker. And if you want to take a photo of me with a mobile device, remember that they tend to store the geolocation into the metadata. Don't let that happen. Deactivate saving location in metadata before you even consider moving to take the photo. And in Android, it's not clear that simply deactivating location processing will do the job. But in the photo app, in the camera app, there will be a setting to turn off location and metadata. And that is exactly what you need to turn off. And as for eye monsters, I hope you don't have those. Meanwhile, is there anyone here who could make a recording, audio or video? I can't hear what you say if you say it that quietly. But if there's somebody here who would like to do it, please do it. But, and you can put a sound recorder here. Do that right now, please. Why wait? I'll give you a moment to do it. Is there anyone who can do it? Good. Is that a camera too? Oh, good. Anyway, with recordings, I do have some conditions for recordings, for distributing the recording. And that is, first of all, do it in a format that free software can handle. If a VLC in a free gnu/linux distribution can play it, then it's a good format. But the next thing is, make sure that the distribution website is not pushing people to run a non-free program. For instance, YouTube. If you access YouTube with most browsers in the normal way, YouTube sends a non-free JavaScript program to run in the user's browser. So that is leading people to run non-free software. Now there is an extension that you can load into Firefox, and that comes preloaded in our browser, IceCat, which eliminates the need to run that JavaScript and supplants it. And you can even turn off the JavaScript coming from the page. So, okay, if your people are going to visit it that way, maybe YouTube would be okay, but you know most people won't do that. So choose a website that doesn't even try to send any non-free software. Don't lead people who don't understand the issue into running a non-free program. It probably spies on them. And finally, please put on the recording the Creative Commons No Derivatives license. And please send mail to me, because we might want to post this recording if it came out well. So, this talk is not my usual free software talk. By the way, is anyone going to get me some water? Is anyone, oh good, because I'm terribly thirsty. Terribly, terribly thirsty. Oh good. Maybe the GNU is thirsty too. Thanks. This talk is about the danger of digital surveillance, which has made digital activities a menace to the people who do them if they're done in the usual ways. In fact, I'm afraid that the main legacy of digital technology will be the establishment of totalitarian control over everyone's life, worse than the Stasi could do. Much, much worse. So there are various ways that the data are accumulated. Often it's done through your own digital devices. They're designed to spy on you. Sometimes it's done through other systems that you use, but that don't belong to you. And finally, increasingly, systems are being put into place to track and surveil people in public. Now, in the first case, if it's your device or the software that you have a copy of, you could prevent that if the software is free, or if you replace it with free software, then you can make the device not spy on you. However, for when the surveillance is done through systems that you don't own and I don't own, they don't belong to individuals, we can't fix them that way. The only thing we can do is demand strong laws against collection of data about people. So what are the most sensitive data about people? Well, first of all, there's anything that shows how these people think, their political views. But aside from that, and more generally, more broadly than that, the most sensitive data about a person are where does person go during the day, what does person do there, and who does person talk with? Where do you go, what do you do, and who do you talk with during your day? These are the most sensitive things to know about a person. These are the things that must not be known, must not be collected. To know what car you own, well, that's okay. We know a free society can coexist with a state that knows who owns which car. I'm not worried about that. But to know where the car goes during the day, that is intolerable. To know who owns each house, that's okay, we know. To know who owns each business, we wish the state knew who owns each business. You can live with that. That doesn't lead to totalitarianism. But to know what you buy, that is terribly dangerous. So first I'll talk about free software and the danger of surveillance through software, because free software is a way to prevent that. So I will give a brief version of my talk about free software. First of all, when I say free, first of all, what is free software? It's software that respects users' freedom and community. So it's software controlled by the users. What's the problem?
I will just put the cable.
What? Okay, if you wish. So it's free in the sense of freedom. When we say free software, we're talking about freedom. We do not talk about price. We do not mean gratis. In German, it's freie Software. We don't mean kostenlos. Your copy might be kostenlos, but we don't care. Maybe you paid for it. That's okay too. That is a minor side issue which we pay little attention to because it's not as important as freedom. Freedom is tremendously important, so that's what we pay attention to, and we refuse to be distracted by a mere matter of price. So, in another language, this is how we distinguish. So what is a program and what is a computer? A computer is a universal computing engine, but at a conceptual level, it's very simple. It only knows how to do one thing, and it does that one thing millions of times per second. It gets the next instruction, and it does what that says. And then it gets the next instruction and does what that says. And the next and the next. The instructions come from a program. Depending on what instructions are in that program, it will direct the same computer to do this or that or that or that or that or that, or potentially an infinity of other things that a computer can do. With the right instructions, the same computer will do whatever you wish, except the impossible things that a computer can't do. But within the realm of the possible, you could make that computer do anything with the right set of instructions. The question is, who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's you when really it's someone else. You might think your computer is obeying you. I'm showing an eye monster here. When really it's obeying its true master all the time. And it does what you ask for if its true master approves, and otherwise it doesn't. With any program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. It's always one or the other because there's no other possibility. When the users control the program, that is free software. Why so? Well, free software means software that respects users' freedom and community. But what does freedom mean? Freedom means having control of your own life, control of the activities that you do in your life. But if you use the program to do an activity, control of the activity requires control of the program. So when the users control the program, that program respects their freedom and their community. I'll explain in a couple of minutes how community comes into it. So it's free software. At the practical level, control of the program requires the four essential freedom. Freedom, and because, so these become the practical criterion for whether a program is free. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program any way you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it to do your computing activities the way you want to do them. Why do we insist on source code? Well, there's some source code. It's like a combination of English and math. If you've learned the programming language, you can read it, understand it, and change it to do something else. But in order to run it, we generally convert it into executable code, which is an enigmatic series of ones and zeros. So it's hard to understand, even for programmers. Well, this is a trivial program. It wouldn't take very long to look up what instructions those ones and zeros stand for, since there might only be 3 of them. But when a program gets to be a little bigger than that, it gets to be a substantial job. And even once you've seen what the instructions are, figuring out what they mean is hard. For a real program that might have 100 million ones and zeros, this job is so hard people don't even think of it except as a last resort in cases of desperation. So if the users only get these enigmatic ones and zeros, practically speaking, they're being denied the freedom to change the software. Well, these two freedoms, 0 and 1, together give each user separately control over the program. Separate control means I'm free to change my copies, and you're free to change yours, and you're free to change yours, and you're free to change yours. Well, separate control is, and so here's one user who is exercising per freedom 1 to change per copies. Well, this level of control is essential, but it's not enough because most users are not programmers. They don't know how to study and change source code, and there's no reason they should know how. They may not even be interested. They do other things. There are many different useful things to do in life, many different kinds of talents and abilities that people can have. So, it's not an acceptable answer to say, well, you should know how to understand and change source code. But even though they're not programmers, they still deserve control over their computing. How can non-programmers have that? Through collective control. which is the freedom to cooperate with other users to exercise control over what that program does and make it do what the group of users wants to do. Well, here we see a group of 3 users who were working together and then 2 other users who were not. In the group, the 2 on the right are both changing the code. They must be programmers. The one on the left is not changing the code. Maybe person is not a programmer, but is exercising control of the program by participating in the group's decisions about what changes to make. And as for the other 2, well, if they all know each other, they're free to work together, but it's not required. They all have a choice about whether to work with the others. Well, collective control requires 2 more essential freedoms. That's why there are 4 of them. Freedom 2 is to make exact copies and then give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. With these 2 freedoms, the group can function. Any group can function. When one member of the group makes a modified version, person through per freedom 3 can make copies of that and distribute them to others in the group. And each of them through freedom 2 can make more exact copies of that version and redistribute them to others. Each one of them also has freedom 3, so a person can make a modification of that version and distribute it too. But that's not the scenario I'm showing here. The group does not have to have a formal structure or a name or a list of members. Whichever users are working together today, they are a group and they're free to do so. So freedoms 2 and 3 are not limited as to who you can distribute copies to. You can offer copies to anyone. In fact, you can offer copies to the general public, which means publishing that version. It's getting hot in here. I wonder if it's possible to open any doors or windows. You know, occasionally there is a use for windows. Oh, I forgot to tell you this, but I should tell you this joke, this story. You know, the European Union is considering what to do about daylight savings time. And it might be eliminated entirely, or it might be extended to cover the entire year. People don't realize this, but daylight savings time was invented by a German politician. And he was so proud of this that he changed his name to Adenauer. So, if the program comes with the 4 freedoms, then the users, both separately and collectively, control what the program does. And that makes it free software. And let me repeat these 4 freedoms because they're so important. Freedom 0 is to run the program any way you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is to study the source code and change it so it does things the way you wish. Freedom 2 is to make exact copies and give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. But if one of these freedoms is missing or incomplete, then the users do not control the program. Instead, the program controls the users and the owner controls the program. which means that this program, this non-free or proprietary program, this user subjugating program, specifically because it is non-free, it generates a system of unjust power for the developer over the users. Every non-free program is an injustice. It may not be visibly annoying you today, but it is always an injustice. It's always something that should not exist. It's better to do nothing at all than develop a non-free program. Because if you do nothing at all, you're not doing harm to the world. But if you develop a non-free program, you're doing harm to the world. At least if anybody else uses it, then it's harm. And so you shouldn't do that. I could imagine a situation where I could forgive it. You know, if somebody points a gun at you and says, write this non-free program, I could forgive you. I'd probably go along also under those circumstances, but I have a feeling that the resulting program would not work very well. But if you need to make some money, do it some other way. I decided that if I needed to make money and couldn't do it by working on free software, I'd rather become a waiter than write non-free software. There's nothing unethical about being a waiter. It's perfectly respectable and honorable. Developing non-free software is not. But, well, this is the basic injustice of every non-free program just because it's non-free. But because the developers, owners know that they have power over the users, they are tempted all the time to take advantage of that power to mistreat the users for their own advantage. So they put in malicious functionalities of many different kinds. After all, they know that if they make the program act maliciously, the users can't correct that. They have power that they can exploit. And there are many different ways, but one of them is spying. Non-free programs generally spy on the user. It's the usual case, by the way, that non-free software is malicious. If there may be some non-free programs which do not have malicious functionalities, but they are the exception. So this example is the Amazon swindle. That's not its official name. But since it swindles their users out of the traditional freedoms of readers of books, I think the name swindle fits the product. And one thing it does is total surveillance. It reports everything that the user does. It sends the title of the book to Amazon servers. So even if the user obtained the book somewhere else, Amazon still knows which book person is reading. And it sends the page number too, so Amazon knows where in the book person is reading it. And if the user enters any notes or highlights any text, that's all sent to Amazon servers also. Total Orwellian surveillance of reading. But surveillance is normal practice nowadays in proprietary software. Flash Player spies on the user for the websites that send Flash. The 5 generally used proprietary operating systems, I mean Windows, Mac OS, Android, iOS, and Chrome OS, all spy on the user, sending data to servers, each in its own way. Many of them require the user to sign up for an account and give permission for surveillance, but consent is not enough to legitimize surveillance. We have to get rid of that idea completely. It turns out that the manufacture of consent is something that businesses have mastered. They say, in order to use this service, you must consent for all the data we're going to collect about you, including a long list of vague categories, very broad, and others. And people agree because they've been brought to the point where they can't imagine doing without the products that they're going to use or that are going to use them. And then the apps typically spy on people too. Well, I just read that some Android apps were caught reporting users' location even after the user said, no, this app can't look at my location. Because the apps cooperate with each other. If one of them can get the user's location, it tells the rest, so that each one can report to its own owner, and maybe others as well. And that's in addition to the surveillance that Android itself does, and the tracking that the phone network does. Somebody did a study of hundreds, maybe I think 1,000 of the most popular Android apps, and determined that, it was checking for one particular surveillance mechanism that was easy to detect without seeing the source code of the application. You could detect it just by running the app and seeing what was happening, and found that of the paid apps, 60% were snooping, and of the unpaid gratis apps, 90% were snooping. I don't say free apps because none of these were free software. So I think I'm justified in saying that surveillance of the user is the normal practice. Treating the user honestly is the exception. And of the apps that the investigator couldn't detect as snooping, they may have been snooping in other ways that this investigation couldn't detect. Now, many devices nowadays are designed so that they're tethered to a server controlled by the manufacturer. So, of course, they're constantly snooping on people. And nowadays, often the only way the user who supposedly owns the product can send it a command is through the manufacturer's server. And the answer comes back through the manufacturer's server, which means the manufacturer is spying on everything. And Google felt that that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to find out whatever the user did through the Google Home controller. No, Google had a plan to require manufacturers of other products, if you want your product to be controllable through the Google Home controller, you must agree to inform Google of everything that the user does with that product, whether it was done through the Google Home controller or not. So it's pressuring other companies to give it total information about users' lives. The other nasty thing about this architecture is if the manufacturer switches off the server, all the users can't give commands to their products anymore. And the manufacturer will do that if the disservice that it provides is no longer bringing in enough money to make it worth operating the server. So as the devices get to be somewhat old, they may all break one day because the server is off. And I saw that this was happening a few months ago. I read that this was happening for some kind of product. And another case, Microsoft set up a system for reading ebooks with DRM, digital restrictions management, that was based on sending a query to Microsoft's server every time the user wanted to start reading a book. And this was costing too much, so Microsoft announced it would switch off the server and all of those books would stop working. So any product which is tethered to the manufacturer's server is obviously intolerable. By the way, there's a broad range of such products. There is still a home security camera which users could connect to directly and watch, but then the manufacturer said, starting now, you're going to have to get an account on our server and connect to our server. And I think it also involved paying rental for the account in order to watch the device more than a few minutes. But what this implies is that the manufacturer is watching all the time. Who knows who else is watching? Maybe the FBI is watching. Maybe some criminals are watching. There's even a sex toy which was designed this way. So it accepts commands from somebody else over the internet. Well, that functionality could be enjoyable in some circumstances. But I expect that the other person has to make an account on the server, which means that the company knows who it is. And then all the commands have to go through the server, which means the company knows exactly what these people are doing together, at least in terms of the commands and the responses. But we know that the product was designed for surveillance because they put a thermometer in it. Now, why do you need a thermometer in a sex toy? Did you ever want a thermometer in your sex toy? I doubt it. Why in the world would you need that? But the manufacturer wants a thermometer so it can tell whether the device is in contact with a human body. And I suspect it can also tell how the device is in contact with a human body through that same temperature measurement. If they can't tell enough, they'll put more sensors into the next model. I mean, to me, the idea of getting a product like that was ludicrous. Well, but that's digital surveillance for you. Of course, there are other malicious things that these products do. There is digital restrictions management, DRM, where the device is designed specifically to restrict people, specifically to stop the users from doing what they want to do. So this means instead of your servant, it's your prison guard. This example is the Blu-ray. Some discs come with a Blu-ray that will attack the user who tries to copy or even watch the disc in the wrong part of the world. Well, my rule personally about DRM is if a device was designed with digital handcuffs to chain me and stop me from doing things, then I will not use it at all unless I have available, personally to hand, everything needed to break the shackles and do what the device was designed to stop me from doing. If I can't use the device in freedom, I don't want it at all. So I have never used a Blu-ray disc. Someday, if there's free software to do all of this, I might use one. But until then, Absolutely no. I value my freedom more than seeing all the movies, any or all of the movies ever made. Some people might regard that as insane. But that is what I think. Those are my values. The 5 widely used proprietary operating systems, I mean Windows, Mac OS, Android, iOS, and Chrome OS, all implement the basis for these digital shackles, and apps that deal with media then use that to implement the shackles, and the Amazon swindle also has DRM. And then there are backdoors. A backdoor means a program or a product is listening for commands from somebody to tell it to do something nasty to the user. In the Amazon swindle, there's a backdoor for remotely erasing books. It's hard to find out about backdoors. After all, they don't let us look at the source code, so how do we know that there's a backdoor? Only through observing it functioning. And that's what happened with the Amazon swindle. One day, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book, and of course the users, those who tried to read that book, noticed it wasn't there. Some of them saw the book disappear while they were in the middle of reading it. So this was a grand Orwellian act. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. If I were writing fiction, I would never have picked that. It would have been too implausible for fiction. It just happens to be historical fact. There was a lot of complaint about this, so Amazon said it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. Which, if you've read 1984, was not very comforting. But Amazon doesn't seem to have taken that promise very seriously, because a few years later, it returned to remotely erasing books without even an order from the state. So this is obviously crap. I wish it were unusual in being obviously crap. Well, we know of a few other backdoors. There's a backdoor in iOS that allows Apple to remotely erase any app. And in Android, Google can remotely erase any app, or it can forcibly install any app. A backdoor in a driverless car could be very dangerous, because it could be used to tell the car to take you to someplace you didn't ask to go, like the CIA black site or secret police headquarters, or even non-secret police headquarters. And it would do it, and it could be told not to let you unlock the doors. There's no limit to what nasty thing it could do. Now, will this feature exist? Will countries use it? I'm sure China will. I'm sure Saudi Arabia will. Perhaps in that country, the taxis will be equipped with saws so that you could arrive at their chosen destination pre-dismembered. And in Germany, I guess that depends on which parties are in power in the future. I wouldn't trust the US to respect our freedoms. So what we need to do is make sure that such taxis have absolutely no way of determining who the passenger is, and that they do not send any reports that might enable some central system to know who the passenger is. No biometric censors at all. Then there is censorship. Apple pioneered censorship of apps in the iPhone, the first generally usable and general use computer in which users could not freely install the application software of their choice. They were limited to installing the programs approved by Apple from the App Store. Apple practiced this censorship power arbitrarily based on its own business interests and political positions until 2017, at which point China ordered Apple to block certain apps that people could use to get through the Great Firewall. And Apple discovered that it had to obey China. That China had Apple over a barrel, that Apple could not refuse to censor for China, but this is only because Apple had given itself the power to censor for itself. If Apple had made these computers respect users' freedom, at least minimally, like the other computers before it, then it would have had an answer to China. Oh, China, of course, we always want to make you happy, but this we have no ability to do. We don't control what users install. Poor Apple. Forced to do wrong for China and no longer only for itself. When users found a way to bypass the censorship, they called it jailbreaking, recognizing that this computer was designed to be a jail for the user. Sometimes you find a universal backdoor. That means that the owner can change the code at a distance. It's universal because it means the owner can do any nasty thing whatsoever to the user. Step 1, write code to do that nasty thing. Step 2, forcibly install that code. Step 3, well, let it run. So it means that the user is totally at the mercy of the owner of that program. Microsoft Windows has a universal backdoor since Windows XP. It was discovered by analysis of output messages by some experts who deduced that Microsoft could forcibly install any change in the software. Microsoft did not acknowledge that this was true, but with Windows Vista, it proudly announced this using a nicer sounding name, Auto Upgrade. It's the same thing as a universal backdoor, except it sounds nicer. And this illustrates an important point. With a non-free program, you have no security against whoever controls the program. With Windows, you have security 0 against Microsoft. With macOS, you have security 0 against Apple. And with Android, you have security 0 against Google. But every non-free software is developed and owned by some entity, so every non-free program has a gap in its security, a gap that's pointing in a particular direction and is completely empty. It's like building a castle where there's a 50-foot gap in the walls in some particular direction. How safe are you? And there's another nasty thing we know about Windows, which is that when Microsoft learns about a security hole in Windows, before it fixes that bug, it informs the NSA. So the NSA can attack the computers of users of Windows. Now, we know this through the press. We do not know of similar facts about any other company and program, but that doesn't mean it isn't so. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You can't assume any non-free software developer is not doing the same thing for the same country or a different country or 10 countries, who knows? So what that shows is the users of proprietary software are victims of proprietary malware. Malware means software designed to mistreat the user through its operation. And I've given you only maybe 10 to 20 examples of non-free programs that are malware, but almost everybody that uses any non-free software is using at least one of them. So we know almost everybody that is using non-free software is already the victim of proprietary malware. And I didn't even mention all the kinds of malicious functionalities like forced incompatibility, addictiveness. There's so many. Of course, they pay lots of clever people to find more ways to mistreat their users. And we have hundreds more examples. If you look at gnu.org/malware, you'll find hundreds of examples, I think something like 400, categorized so that you can look for them based on who does it, what kind of product, what kind of malicious functionality. But this is enough to show you the general point. Non-free software is going to be malware. And in particular, it's going to spy. And they do it because they've found they can make money by doing it. That's all the incentive they need. The idea of valuing in any sense the interests or freedom of the user has basically disappeared from non-free software. Instead, they look for creative ways to pretend that this is treating users with respect. Now, it's important to understand that any program can be released as free software, and any program can be released as non-free software. In fact, any program can be released as free software over here and non-free software over there at the same time. It could be the exact same code. And the reason is the difference between free and non-free software is purely a matter of how the program is made available for use. This is not a question of what's in the program, not a question of what the program does, not directly. Directly, what the program does has no effect on whether it's free. You could take any program whatsoever, and if you had legal control over it, you could release it as free software. And you could also release it as non-free software. Both of them are possible to do. By contrast, the difference between free software and the difference between honest software and malware is purely a matter of what's in the code, what it's going to do in operation. So these are completely orthogonal dimensions, free or non-free depending on how it's made available for use, and honest or malware depending on what the code says. So all combinations are possible in principle, but in practice, they're correlated very strongly. Free software tends to be honest, and proprietary software tends to be malware. And the reason has to do with power. The non-free program is controlled by an owner that has power over the users through that program, and thus an incentive to mistreat the users through that program, and therefore usually does so. Power corrupts, and the power of the non-free software owner over the users corrupts. They've been so thoroughly corrupted that most of them never even dream of being anything else. But with free software, and so the consequence is you can never rationally trust a non-free program. if you're thinking, you better know that the developer is probably mistreating you just because it can and will make money that way. So the only way to trust the program is through blind faith, usually in a company that has already proved it doesn't deserve any such faith. But with free software, you can rationally trust it because you know that it's the user community of the program that has ultimate control over it. And and we contributors to that program know that. We know that although we can contribute changes, we are not the ones with the ultimate say. The users are, and if we put in something that the users don't like, they will change it sooner or later. And if we put in something that is devious and nasty, somebody will figure that out, and the users will change it. Of course, the users can change bugs as well. Most of the bad things in a free program were not put there intentionally, they're mistakes. But the users can also fix the mistakes, and that's very important. So what that means is that the users of a non-free program have a defense against any eventual malicious functionality. Namely, they don't have to just swallow it, they can change it. And if you're not a programmer, well, there are other users who are. And they will want to protect themselves, but they will also appreciate the good of protecting other users, including you. So it's not necessary for every user to be a programmer, for every user to have a rational basis to trust the user community of that program. Now, this defense is not perfect. It doesn't guarantee that no free program will ever have a malicious functionality. But it's a hell of a lot better than being totally defenseless against owners that usually do put in malicious functionalities, and there's nothing the users can do. So you should recognize a non-free program is a trap to mistreat you and escape and come to the free world that we built with the GNU operating system and the kernel Linux. Now, this is as far as I'm going to go talking about free software right now, because it's true that with free software, we can prevent the surveillance. We can fix the program not to spy on us, but the software in our computers is not the only thing that spies on people digitally nowadays. The problem has become bigger and deeper than that. First of all, there are the systems we use to communicate, systems that don't belong to us. For instance, your internet service provider is very likely to be keeping track of who you communicate with. Now, it used to be that phone companies could keep track of who someone spoke with by phone, but did this only in special cases for people who were suspected for some particular reason. But nowadays, they're treating everyone like a suspect. And this is incompatible with a free society. So there's a big political stir in the United States because under President Obama, regulations were made that the ISPs couldn't sell that information. And I said, this is not enough. They shouldn't be allowed to record that information. They shouldn't be allowed to notice except with a court order. Then we would be safe. Well, Republicans, the party of plutocracy, they got rid of those regulations, and there's been a campaign to bring them back. And I support it reluctantly because I feel it's focusing on an inadequate solution that won't protect people's freedom. And of course, phone companies would record who you talk with by phone, and with portable phones, they also record where you are. And by the way, every portable phone has a universal back door in it, which can be used to convert it into a full-time listening device, which listens all the time and transmits all the conversation it hears. And this is not just the spy phones. When they call something smart, think spy, because that's what it's doing. With a smartphone, the operating system can spy for one company, and 100 apps can be spying for 200 or 500 other companies. But in addition, the phone network is snooping on your movements, something it can do at a much lower level. It can triangulate on the location of your phone, so even without GPS, it gets a precise location. And then somebody else, perhaps the local police or a local criminal gang, can use a stingray device and to see that you're somewhere near a protest, because that can detect all the phones which are in that small area. So there could be many different kinds of surveillance going on with the same mobile phone. When I found out about all these things, I realized that the mobile phone was Stalin's dream. What would Stalin have wanted to hand out to everybody in the Soviet Union? A device that would track per movements and listen to the conversations around per all the time, day and night. And Stalin would probably have ordered everybody to take one. But today's totalitarians are more subtle. They didn't start out ordering people to take one. They just started luring and pressuring people to take one until almost everybody had one. And then in some countries, they're starting to change how services are used so that there's some government services it's hard to arrange to use without having one of those Stalin's dream devices, and maybe hard to get a job. It may be, all sorts of things that people find it hard to do, and except for those who value their freedom enough to fight for it, people are surrendering. But we need to fight this. We need to fight this by refusing. Now, you get some of the same problems with a PC, but with a PC, at least you can browse hiding your location by going through Tor. And you can prevent tracking your identity by changing your MAC address very often. And then if you use the right browser, you can avoid giving personal information to the sites. But even when a site, occasionally you might want to tell a site who you are. I very rarely do that at all. I don't want to use today's online disservices. But when you want to do that, at least they can't tell where you are if you're going through Tor. So you're much more protected with one of these than you are browsing the same sites with a mobile phone, because the way the mobile phone connects will not let you protect your privacy even partly like this. So this has to do with things like ISPs, cable TV. Nowadays, almost all the TVs that are sold are, quote, smart TVs, meaning spy TVs. They're designed to report what you are watching. And a manufacturer said, well, of course they're all smart. If we couldn't track users and sell that data, we'd have to charge more for the TV. Well, okay, I'll pay for freedom. I'll pay for anonymity. I'll pay not to be surveilled. There's even some kinds of smart TVs which have a video camera. And they had a security flaw as well, and some cracker broke the security to use the camera and start watching people. There's a, I suppose still is, a British comedian who told the joke, a lady came up and said, didn't I see you on such and such? And I responded, I'm sorry, we can't see out the other end. I don't know. Well, that's changing now. Maybe they wouldn't give that information to the performers in a program, but the company is starting to collect that kind of info. Who knows what? Next, there may be a face recognition module in the TV. That would make it really smart. So this applies to cable TV systems, to ISPs and phone companies. But it also applies to payment. Now, I better show you this button that I often wear. It says, don't be tracked, pay cash. And I'm serious about this. I don't make exceptions. I use my credit card for flights. After all, they demand to know my identity. That shouldn't be the case for domestic flights. You shouldn't be required to give your name for any kind of domestic transport. We see a few countries trying to make it difficult. I had to really push to get an anonymous ticket in a train station in France, but I insisted, because they have no right to know where I'm traveling, or where you're traveling, or where anyone is traveling. And these transportation systems are tracking people too. And this is a worldwide trend, and of course, it may have started in China. Something like 10 years ago or 8 years ago, I went on one of China's impressive high-speed trains and saw that everybody's ID was checked. You'd expect a tyrannical state like China to do that. Why the hell are supposedly free countries doing this? In Switzerland, there used to be a convenient system of train passes. If you lived there, you could buy a train pass and then just get on any train or bus, and if a control occurred, you'd show your pass. Good. And then it was replaced with a system where you were required to register your pass getting on and in some cases getting off, which means people are being tracked. If the GDPR is to mean anything, it would have to be interpreted as saying that that kind of train pass is forbidden. It is obviously possible to sell passage in trains without knowing who is buying. Therefore, the law should require that the system not ask, not find out, not remember, not know anything about who the passengers are, with the possible exception of specific court orders to track a certain person or people at a certain place for a certain amount of time, because this is how we have to keep the power of the state in check. If the state can track everybody all the time, it becomes too powerful, and it will be tempted into using this power in horrible ways. We have to limit this power so that it can only be used for legitimate purposes, so that it doesn't build a database that invites tyrannical use. And in some cities in Europe now, if you want to pay to park, you're required to put in the license plate number in a computer. So that system not only collects money, as other systems used to do in the past, but it tracks everybody's movement with cars. And that must be eliminated. It's too dangerous. The arguments for this are that it makes it cheap and easy to check for illegal parking. So what? What importance does that have compared with people's privacy? You will find, of course, a tremendous focus on data protection, meaning once they collect enormous data about people, trying to prevent it from being misused. But that attempt is incomplete. You see, once the database exists, it will be misused because there are so many ways it can be misused. It can be misused by the organization that collected it. And data protection regulations may limit that. It can be misused by employees of the organization. Now, that's against the rules, but you see people do break rules. So just saying it's against the rules doesn't mean it won't happen. Harold, would you like to make me some more tea? Oh, there is. I've only made one mug of tea. Let me make sure I've drunk it all. There. Thank you. So then the data can be leaked somehow, and then all sorts of people might use it to hurt people. Or crackers might break the security of the server and steal the database and use it to hurt people. And finally, the state might come in and demand a copy and use it to hurt people. The GDPR doesn't even try to stop that. It doesn't cover so-called security activities, which are the ones that give the biggest threat of tyranny. So because of this, I think that data protection is a red herring. We need laws against designing systems so that they collect data about people. This has to be kept to the minimum possible level, so that if a service could possibly be implemented anonymously, it must be anonymous. And this has to cover private companies as well. When Uber and its competitors identify passengers, they're creating a database of the most dangerous kind. Where do you go? What do you do and who do you talk with? Well, this is tracking where you go. Because this is so dangerous, I absolutely refuse to be a customer of any of those companies. But not only that, Uber is trying to destroy the competition by running at a loss. It loses, I think, more than $1 billion a year. It's hoping to eliminate other ways for people to travel so that they will be prisoners of Uber. And because of that, I feel we need to actively fight it. It's not enough just to say, I refuse to touch you. No, I won't get in an Uber car even if someone else is paying. I look for opportunities to fight Uber. That's why I publish why you should not do business with Uber. And it's the same, Uber has done some other secondary evil things which Lyft hasn't done. But Lyft also makes people identify themselves and keeps track of where they go. And that is unacceptable. So we should organize to require them to permit anonymous transportation that doesn't track anyone and make that a requirement of being licensed to operate. But in general, payment systems that track people are a threat. I guess put it up here, please. Here it will stay. Yeah, I will. Actually, it doesn't take long for such a small amount of water. I'd say do it now. Thanks. I saw an article from the 1960s proposing that a system to record all payments people make would be a wonderful system of keeping control over everyone. I posted a link to it. Well, now we know they're right. And I was horrified to see in the airport that there's well, first of all, they now make you pay €1 to use a cart. That is a vicious form of inhospitality that I think was invented in the United States, the land of no hospitality, where everything is charged. I'm sad to see that it spread to Germany, but even worse, you can't pay with a coin. You can only pay in a way that is tracked. Now, I was actually thinking yesterday of maybe getting a cart because I had more luggage than usual, but not that way. No, thanks. So, there are many of these systems that people interact with, which we can't fix just by insisting on running free software in them because they're not ours. We don't control what software's in them. If a driverless taxi someday comes to pick you up, well, it doesn't directly solve the threat, it doesn't prevent the threat to your privacy or your health and life if there's free software in it, because it's not yours. If it's running only free software, those copies belong to the taxi company, not to you. So you're not allowed to change them. The taxi company's allowed to change them. And of course, that company should have control over its computing also. But that doesn't make it treat you ethically. That's got to be a separate requirement that we put on companies. Respect the anonymity of your clients, of the people you deal with, and so on. And then there are the systems that are set up purely to track and snoop on people. Things like license plate cameras, face recognition cameras, systems to recognize people by their heart rhythms. I read that such a system was just experimentally developed. Who knows, we may face that in the future. Any sort of thing that is put in public just to snoop on people. And that includes surveillance cameras, cameras that watch someplace that isn't somebody's home and inside someone's home, and then they transmit the video somewhere else where people could be watching and tracking you around the city. Several decades ago, people installed security cameras. They would watch some area, they would make a recording locally, which would last for a few weeks and then would be overwritten. And during that time, if somebody wanted to look at it, person would have to come there physically and take out the recordings, which meant that it wasn't feasible to track everybody's movements all the time using cameras like that. It was too much work to see what one camera had recorded. So they were useful for security, but not threats of surveillance. We should require cameras to be of that kind. Laws should permit security cameras and prohibit, absolutely, surveillance cameras. No remote transmission of these videos. People should be allowed to make video recordings from time to time as they go around, go through their lives. But a systematic scheme, a system to collect these and bring them to one place, that should be illegal. Because that's what makes it too easy to persecute dissidents. In many cases, we can prevent systems from doing people harm, doing the public harm, just by keeping the data dispersed. And we should have legal requirements to do that, specifically to prevent massive surveillance, but still have a way to look at whoever committed a crime. I've written a bunch of suggestions about methods we can use to do the jobs we want to do while protecting people's privacy. Look at gnu.org/philosophy/surveillance-vs-democracy.html. But the basic point of that is that there is a maximum level of surveillance of people in general that is compatible with democracy. And here is how I work out what that level is. Democracy means that the people control what the state does and how. But in order to control that, we need to know what it is. We need to monitor what the state does and how. But states often do things secretly and try to conceal from the public how they do things, what they're doing, especially the nastiest things, the things that are war crimes or crimes against humanity. So how do we, or massive surveillance, and how do we find out in those cases? We find out through the help of whistleblowers, the heroes that are willing to take a risk to show us what we have a right to know about our governments. And that gives us a chance to try to make them stop it. But governments tend to call these heroes criminals, spies, and try to put them in prison, as they did to Edward Snowden. And at this point, there's something I have a duty to say. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Assange also played a role, of course, in publishing things like the Collateral Murder video, and now the United States wants to put him in prison for ages for his acts of journalism. In 2012, when Assange was asking for asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, I had an open letter published in Quito in a newspaper suggesting how Ecuador could respond. I suggested give Assange asylum, but tell the government of Sweden that if it had accusations against Assange, it could interview him in the embassy, that basically that Ecuador could say it was not standing in the way of any possible charges. Of course, no charges have been made by Sweden against Assange. And the series of bizarre procedural decisions make it quite clear that the government of Sweden's goal in talking about maybe charging him was to get him into U.S. hands. It was not the way any other person accused of medium-level sexual misconduct would have been treated normally. By the way, those charges are not rape. The actions alleged don't constitute rape in any other country, but they are against the law in Sweden. I don't think it's a way that anybody should act. If he really did it, it wasn't nice. But that's another matter, what I suggested because Ecuador was facing this conundrum. President Correa wanted to protect Assange from being sent to the U.S. to be prosecuted for journalism, but he did not want to interfere with any charges that might come from Sweden about his own personal actions. So I suggested a way to do that. And about a month later, that's what the government of Ecuador did. To what extent I had anything to do with that, I don't know. I hope that my suggestion played a role. In any case, don't jail journalism. That is an attack on democracy and freedom. So, but to get back to the final point I'm making, which is of utmost importance and generality, if the state can find the whistleblowers, it can imprison them. So if we want it to be safe to be a whistleblower, we must make sure that the general level of surveillance of people is not enough to find the whistleblowers. That's what we must do to have a democracy and human rights. We must make sure that surveillance remains below that line. And today, surveillance has gone way above that line. If a measure to protect privacy fails to get rid of most of the surveillance that currently exists, it's not strong enough. if it doesn't make all the companies that want to collect data about people say the sky is falling, it's not strong enough. Now, they will try to confuse us by talking about data protection, about limits on what data can be sold and how. There are usually loopholes in that. For instance, the companies that collect the data, they may, of course, associate it with particular people. They may know the name of the person being tracked in any record. They may sell it anonymized, meaning deleting the direct personal identifiers, but research has shown that it's not that hard to figure out who it's about, or at least who it's probably about. So the data accumulators sell it to data brokers. The data brokers may get it without a name, but they can figure out that this record is about the same person as this one and this one and this one, and one of them has a name, so now it knows who all that data is about. And in the US, the FBI has the authority to demand secretly almost all databases of personal data without going to court. It just gives a, quote, national security letter, unquote, to some employee of whatever organization has the database and says, give this to us or we'll put you in prison. And don't ever tell anybody. So the FBI will get all these databases with the names and combine them into a single record about each person. And this has gone on to a tremendous extent. It was recently published about how much data Palantir keeps about, well, I think they have 600 million records. That's enough to be everyone in the US plus a lot of others. And in some parts of the US, any one of those armed officials that like to shoot blacks can get the full record about basically anybody in a few seconds. So we've got to make sure that those databases don't exist except where there has been some specific justification to make one. It's too much knowledge for a state to have, because it means that if we don't want to be oppressed by that state, we've got to trust that nobody with the power to do so is ever going to decide to do so. Now, we know that we can't trust a lot of them. We recently found out that the current head of the border police in the US was a member of a secret Facebook discussion group together with at least 1,000 or maybe more staff, where they talked about basically despising immigrants. So can we trust people like that to make ethical use of data about people? I don't think so. What we can trust is if the systems don't collect so much data, they've got to be specific kinds of data that is allowed to be collected for some reason. And that's all. So how can we do this? It takes political organizing. And we have to know how to insist on measures that are adequate to deal with the problem, not the half measures that are always proposed, I suspect, proposed because they wouldn't be too painful for the data collectors. They give more of an appearance of respecting our privacy than real respect. We have to realize that real privacy is anonymity. Real privacy is not restrictions on using massive databases about us. It is that they just don't know what we're doing every day. And let's see. So the smart city idea is, well, remember that when you hear smart, think spy. The idea of a smart city is to spy on everything everybody's doing and have a giant database that knows everything about people, and as a result, it could make life totally convenient for those who are considered important enough to deserve this convenience, which won't be most people, I suspect. Most people may get some limited amounts of convenience from it, but they will all be menaced by the possibility of omniscient enforcement of whatever laws may be imposed on them. So the very idea of a smart city as it's conceived of today is an injustice. There may be ways to make use of AI techniques to make some civic systems work better. If these techniques don't know who's going where, don't know who that person is, then they're safe, and if they can do some good, why not? So we have to make sure that they don't know. And we can see the tremendous pressure to implement these spy cities by tracking people. That's where we have to oppose it. We have to say, you must do this in a way that doesn't identify individuals and doesn't collect the data that could enable anyone to identify individuals, and then it's okay. And we see drivers' insurance companies offering a discount if the company can monitor how you drive. Well, if that's done in a way that doesn't snoop on what you do, maybe it's okay. If I were sure that the system would not know where I go, it would only notice how I drive, I could live with that. I don't tend to drive at lunatic speeds. I don't drive all that frequently. I'm probably not one of the best drivers, but at least I don't do very many absurd, stupid things. What is that? Oh, it's a fly. Would you like to empty this cup and make another? I guess, yeah, into the grass. I don't know whether the grass likes tea. But of course they record where you go. If we don't have laws to stop them, they will record where you go. So at this point, I'd just like to say briefly that there are ways you can help the free software movement. So, freedom requires a sacrifice sometimes. Although when you really value freedom, you don't see that as the sacrifice. You don't see the practical inconvenience you accept in order to keep your freedom as the sacrifice. On the contrary, it's the freedom that you would be sacrificing if you accepted those expensive conveniences offered by online disservices and other forms of surveillance. So we need to insist on free software so as not to be tracked through our own computers and our own products. So how do you help? Well, if you've got a talent for programming, write free software, contribute to free software projects. But most people don't have a talent for programming. So instead of forcing yourself to try to program, do something else. Could you put in a little bit more? That's so little. It's so pitifully little. I really like tea. So if you don't have a talent for programming, do something else like organizing the efforts to campaign for the free software movement. We need people to form local activist groups. We need speakers. If you don't know how to speak in public, well, join Toastmasters. There must be a Toastmasters club here. You can get good at it. We need people to persuade schools and governments to move to free software. Schools are making the students use computers that spy on them so that they can then run proprietary programs that enable other companies to spy on them and restrict them also through all the other unjust effects of proprietary software. This should not be allowed in a school. And government agencies, well, they do their computing for the people. And they have a duty to the people, a responsibility to maintain control over that computing rather than letting it fall into private hands, because the government's responsibility is to make sure its computing is done properly for the people for whom the government exists. And we need people to spread these ideas and organize to make it happen. You can help other users. If you're an expert user of gnu+linux, that's the GNU operating system with Linux as the kernel, then start a gnu+linux user group and help other users. Or if there's already a gnu+linux user group, go there and help users. If there's already one, but it calls itself erroneously a Linux user group, which means not giving us any credit for our work, then you could go there and help users and explain that the group really should change its name. And just by saying free software, freie Software, you're helping the free software movement. You see, most people who use or even talk about free software don't know that term anymore. In 1998, the people who didn't want to think of this as an issue of freedom and justice invented a different term to use. They call it open source. And they constructed a different discourse that presents the matter purely in terms of convenience and practical advantage and never raises the moral questions I mentioned in my talk. They carefully avoid those issues because those issues might make some business executives uncomfortable. And they have been so effective that most of the users who've heard about me think that I advocate open source, which I have never done. I have to explain like several times a week in response to emails, I'm sorry, there's a misunderstanding here. You're talking about open source. That's not what I'm in favor of. That's a different idea. So read about the difference, please, and tell me if you agree with the free software movement. Well, just by saying free software, you can spread the awareness that there is a free software movement. I've seen articles published that called me the father of open source. I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I explain about the free software movement. I present its name and the ideas that I've told you today, or earlier forms that I had at the time. And that, of course, is the serious purpose of that letter, to make people aware that there's an issue of freedom and justice here, and open source covers it up. And please don't think that I join in covering it up. But I can't do enough. You, by making an effort to stop talking about open source and talk about freie Software instead, you can help do this if you want to, because you're free. If open source expresses what you are in favor of, well, you're free to say that too. And there are a lot more ways to help in gnu.org/help. We have dozens of different kinds of work that would be useful for you to do to help us. And you can join the Free Software Foundation at fsf.org, or you could do it here and pay your dues in cash. And now it's time for the auction. This is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you buy it, I can sign it for you. If you have a penguin at home, you need a GNU for your penguin. Every penguin should have a GNU. We can accept payment with cash or through a bank card if it can make international purchases by phone, but you have to write a bunch of stuff down, so it's a little inconvenient. We can also accept Bitcoin payment if you have something here to make the payment with. And does anyone know if there is an ATM machine, a bank machine to get cash near here? There is. So another option is you bid, you go out, you get cash, and you come back, because I'm going to be here answering questions for a while. So when you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount as loud as you can, because I have hearing problems. And if you speak quietly, I won't know what you said, so I can't do anything with your bid. And I'm going to start with the regular price of 25 euros. Do I get 25 euros for this adorable GNU? How much? 30. The first time I couldn't hear. Second time I heard you. 30. I've got 30. Do I get 35 for this? How much? I've got 35. Do I get 40? I've got 40. Do I get 45? I've got 45. That's funny. This is not the only time that has happened in my auctions. I've got 45. Do I get 50? 50 or more for this? How much? 50? What are you bidding? I've got 55. Do I get 60 or more for this adorable GNU? I've got 60. Do I get 65 or more? 65 or more for this adorable GNU. I've got 65. I've got 70. Do I get 75 or more for this how much? I've got 75. Do I get 80? I've got 80. Do I get 85? I've got 85. Do I get 90? I've got 110. Do I get 120? 120 for this adorable GNU. Last chance to bid 120 or more for this adorable GNU. Last chance. Going. What? What? Are you bidding? Are you bidding? Okay, so last chance to bid 120 or more for this adorable GNU. Going. Gone for 110. Please come up and pay. How do you wish to pay? Okay. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
I'll sign after the questions. I don't want to delay that more than necessary. Thank you. The GNU is now yours.
Thank you.
This is an adorable book. My book of essays, Free Software, Free Society. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. And the rules of the auction are the same, and the starting price is the same, 25 euros, and I can sign it also. By the way, if you brought a shirt, I can sign those also. Is there anyone selling outside now? Harold, is anyone selling? Because, you know, the merchandise is still there. I hope you'll get some. And the stickers are still there. Please take stickers. I hope all those stickers will be taken and put to good use. Any place people will see it is good use. Just don't put it on your shirt because it won't last. Put it in a place where it will last for a while. So, do I get 25 euros for this? How much? 30. Do I get 35? How much? I've got 35. Do I get 40? How much? Say what you're bidding. I've got 40. Do I get 45 euros? How much? I got 45. Do I get 50 or more for this adorable GNU? Sorry, adorable book. How much? As soon as you start waving your arm, please shout the amount. Don't wait for me to look at you. I've got 55. Do I get 6? I've got 60. Do I get 65 or more? I've got 65. I've got 70. 75 or more? Do I get 70? How much? What? Speak. I've got 75. Do I get 80 for this adorable book? 80 or more to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Last chance to bid 80 or more for this adorable book to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Going. Gone for 75. Please come up and pay. I'll be ready to sign it when the questions roll.
Okay, thank you.
Now it's time for questions.
First question, Richard, to you, to the audience. Should we record the questions and answers?
I can't hear you at all. What?
Should we record the discussion or switch off the camera?
I would like to, but because I think it's useful to publish that.
So we can make a compromise.
I suggest that those of you who have questions, please line up at that microphone and ask your line up in advance. That way, the system works efficiently and fairly. It's fairer because you don't have to wait to be recognized. You get in the line, you get your turn.
Okay, I'm not very experienced as far as data collecting or prevention of data collecting is concerned. So I've just got a question of maybe minor importance, and that is, you said that the mobile phone spy on us. So the simple question is, how can I prevent my mobile phone from spying on me?
You can't.
No.
But
Can't I just break it up and put certain parts on maybe the upper part of the kitchen, the battery?
oh, well, okay. If you want to do physical modification on it, maybe you could, but it wouldn't work as a mobile phone if it weren't spying on you.
Right, so while I'm sleeping, I might break it up and put away the batteries and then everything is all right?
Could, or you could just, you could just throw it away or give it to somebody else who wants to be spied on. Or
Okay.
I've never had one. I learned these things around 2003 because I was considering whether to get a mobile phone. And back then they were not, quote, smart, unquote. They didn't have user installable software at all. All they did was the basic stuff. So that issue didn't arise for me, but I still had to consider whether they were mistreating me, and I found out that they were. Next question.
What about the GPS that is installed in cars, firmly
Installed in what?
in motor cars?
Oh, well, yeah, if I had a car, I would basically stop the antennas from functioning. I would not tolerate a connected car. I would insist on disconnecting it. So there are two antennas. There's, I believe, a cellular modem. And of course, through that, the phone network can track the position of the car. And then there may be the GPS as well, which would enable the car to help track it even more finely. And I would make both of those antennas non-functional. Now, one way is to disconnect it, remove it. Another way might be to wrap it in aluminum foil, because these are radio communications, and metals do not allow radio waves to go through them, because metals are conductors.
In addition, I want to say, I personally, I do not have a car that has a GPS, but I have bought a GPS myself anonymously. Which does
Well, that's
not track me.
it's different.
That's different, yes.
It's different because that means the GPS device you got, I assume it's not connected in any way to the car's systems. So maybe your GPS device doesn't transmit anything about where you are, but maybe it does. If it's proprietary software inside, then you may be invited every so often to update the maps. Well, guess what else it does at the same time as downloading updated maps? It uploads where you have been. But nowadays you can get free software to do the same job using the map data from OpenStreetMap.
Thank you.
Okay, so you briefly touched upon the topic of...
Speak louder, please. I can't hear you.
Okay, so you briefly touched upon the subject of surveillance versus democracy. And so you probably heard about the Fridays for Future protests. I'm going...
The what?
Fridays for Future protests, in essence.
Yes.
You know, it's a movement which has very strong demands for environmental policies. And I heard people say that, well, ultimately democracy is or might not be equipped to deal with this challenge. And no, maybe China's system might, you know.
Actually,
and
let me answer.
The question from my
Before
point is
you
just...
say that, I want to talk to what they said. You can finish in a moment, but we don't really have effectively democracy. What we have is plutocracy. The rich rule. And that is behind many other injustices. Some of those injustices are directly economic, like falling wages for most people, precarious work, but also increasing monopoly or oligopoly in many fields, the concentration of industry, and also the accelerating use of fossil fuels. The reason we have been unable to democratically put an end to these fossil fuels and start moving to renewable energy is because these fossil fuel companies, with their money, have so much power that they've been able to block it all with disinformation and confusion and just don't pay attention, as well as plain old lies. And so the people who say that democracy is not up to this, they've been misled. They think that what's failing is democracy, but in fact what we know is that what's failing is that we don't really have effective democracy.
Okay, so you don't see a contradiction there, because my question was aimed towards, if there were a contradiction, what kind of challenge would it take so everything would be grabbed or on the table?
The challenge is to restore democracy, to defeat the plutocracy.
I see. Thank you.
By the way, I participated in one of the Fridays for Future protests in March. It was not easy for me to get the details of the protest because I refused to run non-free software, and many websites send non-free software in the pages, and then it runs in your browser, and I won't let it run. Our browser has something called Libre.js, which checks the programs in the pages to make sure that they're free. And their publication, well, it actually made use of Facebook. And then it had another site where you could get the details, except that if you tried to, that most of the site depended on non-free software, and I wasn't sure I could even find out about what time the protest was. How sad. And it was purely through failure to pay attention. If they had cared even a little bit about respecting the freedom of the people they were talking to, they could have. I wish I could convince them. I don't know how.
Hi, thank you for the great talk, and I'm also happy to personally thank you for all the great work that has been done with the Free Software Foundation.
I'm more concerned about the work that remains to be done, actually.
Yes, exactly.
Please get to your question.
That's my question. So in the last years, the movement have been very successful in bringing personal computers that are like free and...
Could you get to your question, please?
Yes, I want to compare two situations. I want to compare PC computers with mobile phones. We have been...
Well, right. Mobile computing is a disaster for freedom of every sort. Basically, the companies made a second attempt to subjugate users more. And because they were dealing with people who had no awareness of the issues, they were able to manipulate, lure, and addict the users, and made a situation in which every kind of abuse is normal. And the people who are, when people feel the pain of this, they don't dare to question the assumptions on which that mobile domain is based. They only dare demand small changes in individual areas or with individual companies, and they hardly even demand any laws to stop it.
Sorry, but that's not my question. My question is, nowadays, if I want to solve my questions when I'm sitting at my desk with my personal computer, I can run free software well, and it's cheaper, much easier to use. It gives me
Forget the, yes, you can't
but
do
when I
that
want to
in a
have it
mobile
in my
phone.
pocket and use all these services that makes my life easier.
Well,
Else-
most of them are mistreating you. You need to recognize that many of them are actually disservices, but they are giving you a visible benefit and an invisible abuse.
But why
So
we
I
have
don't
them
want to
with
touch
free
any of
software
those.
philosophy? Why don't we haven't been able to develop
First of all, please, free software is an issue that arises for programs you are thinking of running on your own computer. You get a copy. And the question is, what are your rights to do things to that copy? Are you allowed to study and change it? Are you allowed to redistribute it? Are you free to run it in the way you wish? But these issues do not arise for a service, because a service isn't something you install a copy of. You can't. Even if you had the same software. Let's imagine that the software that runs Facebook servers were free. You could imagine installing it, but if you did, you wouldn't get a competitor to Facebook, because Facebook's advantage is it has billions of users, or useds, as I call them, billions of Zuckers. And you, with no useds, no one would see a reason to switch to your system. You can install free software and run a social network, and it may be a good thing to do. There are free federated social networks like gnu+social. You can run a server for that. The point is that that doesn't solve the problem. You could imagine a replacement for Uber which doesn't track people. Now, there are in some places alternatives to Uber. There are systems even that were set up in some places by taxi drivers. And they may be owned as a cooperative by taxi drivers, but they track people and identify the customers just the same as Uber. So from my point of view, they're equally unjust, and I wouldn't consider using one. My policy towards them is the same as my policy towards Uber. I won't let them spy on me. So this is a different kind of problem. Now, it is true that it's not easy to run smartphones with free software, but there are some models where you can. You can install Replicant, which is a 100% Libre variant of Android. And you could install some apps that are also free software from F-Droid. But you won't be able to do a lot. You know, if the convenience you want comes from these internet disservices, you'll find that they require non-free client software, which won't run on Replicant, and which is not in F-Droid. And of course, they would require you to agree to horribly unjust terms of service. I didn't even begin to get into that, but when I look at the terms of service of any non-trivial service, I very soon see some things I wouldn't dream of ever giving into. Now, there is an attempt to build a portable phone that would to some extent resist the surveillance. In the Librem 5 phone, there will be a switch to turn off the power on the radio processor. See, the radio processor is what can only run non-free software. It's secret. We don't know how to write any free software for it. And that's where the universal backdoor is, and in nearly all phone models, the radio processor is directly connected to the microphone, so it can actually listen all the time and transmit without going through the application processor, which is where Android or Replicant would run. And in addition, it's typically connected directly to the GPS, so it can help track your location too. and they can remotely change the software to do any nasty thing they want. And in most phone models, the radio processor has control over the application processor, so they can tell the radio processor to write a different operating system into the application processor. So if you installed Replicant, somebody through the back door could overwrite it and put in proprietary Android. It's basic. Those phones are designed to make the user totally vulnerable. Well, in the Librem phone, they've changed various things to prevent those kinds of abuses. First of all, the microphone is not connected to the radio processor, so it can't listen unless the application processor decides to show it what the microphone is giving. And the application processor in that phone is running only free software, and the radio processor can't write new software into the application processor. The hardware is designed so that that is not possible. So basically, they've designed to protect the application processor and the microphone and the GPS by having them run by free software exclusively. But there's still the back door in the radio processor, but they can't make it listen because the radio processor can't talk to the microphone directly. So they get rid of a lot of the nastiness of most mobile phones. But the thing they can't get rid of is that it can track your location. Because every mobile phone, in order to receive calls and messages and any other kind of communication, it has to send out a signal every so often saying, "Here I am." And that's how the phone network knows which tower needs to talk to it. But that also means they know they can triangulate, they can determine where you are. And there's just no way you can fix that in the phone. So basically, the designer of the Librem phone has done as much as one can do in the phone itself. Beyond that, well, you'd have to somehow change the network. So I've been thinking about, would I be willing to carry such a thing? And I have an idea for a way maybe it would be okay. If I can, because in that phone, you can just switch off the power for the radio processor, and then it's not going to send any kind of signal. And so if I carry a one-way pager, then people who are trying to reach me could page me, and I would get the page, but a one-way pager doesn't say where you are. The system doesn't know where you are. It just broadcasts, and you get the message. So people could say, well, I'd like to talk with you about such and such. And I could judge when to turn on the radio communication and communicate. And that way, at least, it wouldn't be revealing my location all the time.
So you agree? I think we are on the same page, and I know all these great efforts. Right now, for people using this, we know that there is a lot of sacrifice to be done. What I'm asking is, what is this Free Software Foundation strategy to tackle this?
Well, we don't have one, and the reason is we're a small organization. We don't have an army of volunteers, and we can't hire an army of staff. So basically, the amount we can do in any year is limited. We can't make, it would be absurd for us to make a many-year strategy and expect to carry it out, because during that time, things would change in ways we can't anticipate, that will surprise us. So what we try to do is things that will improve the situation somehow. That's the most that would be feasible for us to do. If you become a member of the FSF, enough new members, we could hire another person.
Thank you.
But aside from that, if you do work as a volunteer, you'll be advancing freedom one way or another. So look at gnu.org/help.
I'm doing
Next
that.
question.
I'm an active member. Just
Oh, thank you.
what's the?
But I'd like to move on to the next question, which will be the last one. Well, okay, you too. That's all.
How can you and I and maybe we not getting depressed seeing all this injustice?
I can't understand at all. I'm sorry. I heard, but I couldn't make sense of it. Perhaps
I can repeat it, yes.
Okay.
How can you and I and maybe we not getting depressed by seeing all this injustice?
Oh, well, you see, I know that we have advanced quite a bit, that our situation for digital freedom is a lot better than it would have been if there were no free software movement. And our hopes of having a free society depend on this. So we've got to do the best we can. Giving up won't solve anything.
With regard to surveillance.
I can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me now?
You have to pronounce each consonant more clearly. I have hearing problems.
Sorry, I'm a foreigner. With regards to surveillance, do you have any suggestions for fraud protection that usually requires gathering a lot of contextual data?
Sorry, fraud detection?
Yes, exactly.
I'm not an expert on that.
It usually requires gathering a lot of contextual data. So if you have an anti-surveillance mechanism,
Well,
blocks that.
I'm sorry, I don't know enough. But as I said, I generally reject digital payment systems entirely. So, because they would track me. Now, we do have a digital payment system that's anonymous. It's called gnu+linux. But it doesn't require fraud detection of that kind. You see, the gnu+linux system includes verifying the validity of the payment. That's done with encryption. Now, the way you get Thaler tokens is you pay a sort of bank, and in the payment to the bank, how do you do that? It could be identified. They may want to have fraud detection systems at that stage. The point of gnu+linux is once you get the Thaler tokens, you can spend them and no one can ever work out who spent them. And no fraud detection is, no separate contextual fraud detection is needed there.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I'll answer one more question.
I just wanted to ask a question about maybe a contradiction of free software. What do you do to prevent that free software is used by other people to build software that maybe is run to make surveillance or stuff like that?
We can't stop that, and it would be ineffective. That's not a useful place to intervene. Back in the 1980s, I got a request to send a copy of the original Emacs, I think it was, to someone in the Soviet Union. And I can't remember now whether I decided to do it or not. But I realized that they could certainly get it some other way, and that I couldn't, you know, what would they use it for? They might use it for perfectly innocent things. It might be used for pure research. It might be used to write down the list of people to imprison or even shoot. The point is, as the author of a general purpose program for everyone, I have to accept it will be used for all sorts of things, just like a pen. A pen could be used for all those things. A pen could be used to write a check. A pen can be used to write a check honestly. It could be used to write a fake, a fraudulent check. And the thing is, if you're going to make something as general as that, you can't control what it's going to be used for, and it would be wrong if you tried.
But wouldn't it be useful just to try to legally restrict the...
No, that would be a disaster. It would destroy the free software community. And the reason is people have so many different ideas of what they wish nobody else would do. So I'm sure you could imagine that there would be people who want to put on free software restrictions about using it to do this kind of job or that kind of job. There would be people who say, you're not allowed to use this to produce or sell halal meat. And there'd be others who'd say, you're not allowed to use this to, to make or sell non-halal meat. And there would be other, every possible cause that people have an opinion about, you'd see programs carrying rules about what you're allowed to do. What this would mean is that every political or moral dispute in our society would leak into software, making programs that restricted what people could do with them. And if we allowed those into our free software community, it would become useless. So we have to declare a zone of ideological peace by sticking to the definition of freedom zero, which is freedom to use the program however you wish for any purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm glad we're done because it's just after 10.